There are many ways in which one can approach the topic of abortion. It can be approached from a medical perspective, public health perspective, sociological, historical, political science, legal, and unfortunately, in light of events just today in the United States, from a criminal justice perspective, you may have heard that there was a shooting at a Planned Parenthood facility in Colorado Springs. But I'm a philosopher, and so I am going to approach it primarily from a philosophical perspective, and in particular, I'm interested in the way in which the topic of abortion illuminates the more basic question of moral status. I don't suppose there's a way to get rid of this, is there? I don't like that. Okay. All right. Maybe not. All right. Okay. So a little bit of background. As you probably know, abortion is nothing new. They've discovered methods for terminating pregnancies as far back as ancient Egypt. But it didn't become illegal in the United States till the middle of the 19th century. And that's probably because abortion was not at all a safe procedure until penicillin came into common use after World War II. Where abortion is illegal, it is still an unsafe procedure. But legal abortion is safer at any stage in pregnancy for the woman than childbirth. So therefore, any restrictions on abortion cannot be justified in terms of protecting the pregnant woman. They are all based on protecting the unborn, which brings us to the basic ethical question in abortion, the morality of killing the fetus. Now, many opponents of abortion describe abortion as murder, and then since murder is wrong, if abortion is murder, it follows that abortion is also wrong. Simple. And I think in order to evaluate this claim, we have to look more carefully at the concepts of killing and the concept of murder. Abortion kills the fetus. There's no question about that. But is it murder? And the answer to that question, whether a particular killing counts as murder, depends on two distinct issues. The first is, who is killed? Or what is it that's being killed? After all, there are many instances of killing that no one would call instances of murder. Perhaps a more controversial one would be the killing of non-human animals. The majority of people eat meat. They don't require the killing of animals as murder. It's killing, but it's not murder. And even for people who do regard the killing of animals as murder, they would regard many killings of entities as not murder. Human cells can be killed, that's not murder, including gametes, sperm and egg. So that's the first thing. What is it we're talking about that's being killed before we can equate the killing as with an instance of murder? The second issue is whether the killing is a recognized exception to the prohibition of murder. And the most obvious example would be killing in self-defense. It's still killing, but it's not considered murder because it's considered to be justifiable. I will get back to the question of self-defense a little bit later, but for now, what I want to talk about is whether killing a fetus should be regarded as murder. And that comes down to the following question: does the fetus have the same moral status as born human beings, as everyone in this room? It also is the question of whether the fetus has a right to life, which we think everyone in this room, all human beings, born human beings, have a right to life. What about the fetus? The issue of moral status is, to put it perhaps a little crudely, is simply a matter of who counts morally. Who matters morally? When we as moral agents, are making moral decisions, who is it that we have to take into consideration, and on what basis? So, very obviously, mere things don't have moral status. We don't have to worry about the effect on a can when you kick it down the street. And at the other extreme, human beings, people in this room, clearly have full moral status. But there are a range of entities which fall in between, and they're sometimes referred to in philosophy as marginal cases. Fetuses, animals, embryos. Okay. Now, the issue of moral status is a very fundamental one in philosophy and in applied philosophy, and it's not limited to abortion. The treatment of animals, for example. What justifies our using animals, our inflicting pain on animals, and our killing animals? Most people simply take this for granted, but over the last 30 years or so, philosophers have been seriously questioning whether it is justifiable to use animals as tools, as mere means to our ends. It's also the question of moral status comes up with human beings who are alive but permanently unconscious, those who are in persistent or permanent vegetative states, and it comes up also quite recently, especially with a few famous cases of individuals whose brains have permanently ceased functioning, those who are brain dead. In almost everywhere in the United States, they're considered dead, but not everywhere in the world, and there's some question about whether they really are biologically dead. So that brings up the question, if they're dead, are they dead, are they not dead? When does the life of a human being end? Now, many times with abortion, people think the issue is the fetus alive? But I want to suggest to you that's not the right question. Of course, the fetus is alive and can die, but the embryo is also alive and can die, and even gametes, sperm and egg, are alive, and sperm even swim, right? So the question is not, but nobody thinks they have full moral status. So the question is not, is the fetus alive? Rather, the question is, what is the moral standing of the human fetus? Is it one of us? Has all the rights to be treated in certain ways that anyone in this room has? Does it have, for example, a right to life? Clearly, the fetus is human, but this raises a question that philosophers have been looking at for, again, the last 30 or so years. Is moral status appropriately based on genetic humanity? And I'll get into this a little bit later. We've also been looking at the question, not only when does the life of a human being end, but when does it begin? Or as it's sometimes put, when did I begin? In the literature and philosophy, we talk about the pro-life positions, the anti-abortion positions as conservative. It has nothing to do with generally conservative politics, but that's the word that's used. And on the other side, the pro-choice in favor of legalized abortion as liberal, again, not necessarily connected with other liberal views. And I'll use that terminology. Those who are opposed to abortion often come from religious traditions, and in particular, Roman Catholic. But the arguments needn't be based on religion. And generally, in bioethics, we want to restrict arguments to those that can be persuasive to people of different religions or no religion at all, secular arguments. And so I'm only going to talk about a secular argument for the conservative position, and it's one that has actually a scientific rationale. It has been expressed by a previous pope, but it's not based on scripture, it's not based on a belief in souls or any religious terminology like that. Rather, the claim is, look, we now know with modern genetics that at conception, fertilization, you have a new human organism, a new human being. It's not identical with the mother. It's not identical with the father. It has its own unique genetic code. That's when it comes into existence, and every other stage in its development, heartbeat, brain waves, movement, capacity to feel pain, viability, are just development from that morally salient beginning of a new human being. And therefore, none of those stages can count as a time at which you can say, oh, now we have a human being with a right to life, and you can no longer kill it, but yesterday it was okay to do it. No, the conservative says, the only point that makes sense to draw a line is the very beginning. We can distinguish between two varieties of conservatives, extreme and moderate. And as you'll see, there's actually at least two different dimensions on which you can draw these distinctions. One has to do with when a human being comes into existence. And I've just given you the extreme conservative view at fertilization or conception. So the zygote, which is the result, this is the fertilized egg, that's where the human being begins. A zygote is a human being with all the rights of any other human being, including a right to life, may not be killed. The moderate conservative view puts the beginning of a human life, an individual human life, a little bit later, because after the egg is fertilized, it has to travel down the fallopian tubes, and it implants itself in the uterus. And that's a process that takes about 2 weeks. Why implantation? Well, first of all, it's the beginning of a clinical pregnancy, right? That's when you can tell the woman is pregnant, and obviously, in the context of abortion, you can't have abortion if she's not pregnant, right? So, clinical pregnancy. Another feature that makes it seem to be the beginning is that after implantation occurs, the phenomenon of twinning, whereby a single fertilized egg or embryo divides into two, is no longer possible. Now, why should twinning be so important? Well, here's the thinking. I have to be identical with my beginning stage. But if you go back further than implantation, how can I be said to be identical with this fertilized egg, which could have split into 2, 3, 4, 5, the Dion quintuplets were identical twins. Identical twins aren't different kinds of beings than the rest of us, so it would seem that if you really want to have the beginning, it should be after there's no possibility of being twins, because otherwise you're saying that I would be identical with something that might have been 2. And since I'm only 1, that seems impossible. And finally, there's a huge jump in probability that the embryo will become a born human being like anyone in this room after implantation occurs. There's an awful lot of embryo wastage in the first days and weeks after fertilization. The woman probably doesn't even know she's pregnant. She may just think she's having a heavier menstrual period. But there is a lot of wastage in those weeks. So this would also have an implication for what would be acceptable that differentiates the moderate and the extreme conservative, because although the moderate conservative would be opposed to abortion, the moderate would not be opposed to the morning after pill, which prevents implantation. The extreme conservative would regard that as also impermissible. Is abortion ever justifiable for conservatives? Well, again, it depends on whether you're an extreme conservative or a moderate conservative. For the extreme conservative, no. And now I am going to use Catholic terminology, although I don't think it rests on particularly religious beliefs. But here's the idea. When is the killing of one human being by another justified? And according to the extreme conservative, only in cases of self-defense. It is never permissible to kill one human being to save another, or to save more than one, or to bring about good for the society. That's just impermissible. Well, could abortion be seen as self-defense? What about if the woman's life is at stake? What if she'll die if she doesn't have an abortion? And the extreme conservative said, but how can the innocent fetus be regarded as an attacker? And since he's not attacking the woman, abortion, even when the woman's life is at stake, cannot be seen as self-defense. The moderate conservative will allow for some abortions, specifically when it would be necessary to save the woman's life, or perhaps even when there's serious health considerations. And the idea here is that no one is morally obligated to sacrifice their own life to keep someone else alive, and the pregnant woman is not required, morally obligated to sacrifice her life, or even perhaps her health, to save the life of her fetus. This would be heroic or saintly on her part, supererogatory, but not obligatory. What about rape? Rape is often said to be the kind of case where abortion would be permissible. It seems that such a terrible thing has happened. But for the extreme conservative, even in the case of rape, abortion is impermissible. And the argument is a rather compelling one. Why would you think it's permissible to kill the innocent child because its father was a rapist? How is that fair? But the moderate conservative, recognizing the terrible thing that has been done to the raped woman, thinks that it would be just adding insult to injury to force the raped woman, having already been the victim of attack once, to carry and bear her rapist child. And finally, we come to what are called fetal indications, or the possibility that the fetus has some kind of illness or defect. For the extreme conservative, as you might guess, this would never be a justification for termination of pregnancy any more than it would be a justification for infanticide. Once the child is born, the fact that it has an illness or a defect doesn't mean we get to kill it. So if the fetus, and indeed the embryo, and indeed the zygote is an innocent child, it's not permissible to kill it because there's something wrong with it. Moderate conservatives think it depends on how severe the defect is. What if the fetus has a defect that is incompatible with continued existence, for example, anencephaly, where the baby is born without a forebrain? Most of them are either stillbirths or die within weeks. Some of them, depending on the amount of life support they get, can be kept alive longer than that. And the more severe trisomies, trisomy 13 and 18 are examples. But the moderate would agree with the extreme that abortion is not justifiable if the child can survive and indeed have a worthwhile life, a life that will be of value to the child himself or herself. And the example would be Down syndrome. Interestingly, in recent months, a few states in the United States have passed laws prohibiting abortion when it's in order to avoid the birth of a child with Down syndrome. How they were going to effectuate this or put it into practice, I don't know. In any event, it clearly conflicts with Roe v. Wade, which I'll say a little bit about later, the landmark Supreme Court that made abortion a constitutional right everywhere in the United States. They are unconstitutional laws, but given our unusual system in the United States, you can pass unconstitutional laws. They just, if they get tested, the Supreme Court will strike them down. So now let me go from the conservative views on abortion to a liberal view, and I'm specifically going to talk about a view presented by the philosopher Marianne Warren, which has been extremely influential in the philosophical literature. And Warren thinks that the conservative has made a logical mistake, a fallacious move. And the logical mistake is to change the meaning of the term human being in the argument. What's the argument? Well, basically the argument is it is wrong to kill innocent human beings. The fetus is an innocent human being. It's wrong to kill the fetus. Abortion is killing the fetus, therefore abortion is wrong. And what Warren says is that actually the meaning gets changed between the first premise, it's wrong to kill innocent human beings, and the third premise, which is the fetus is an innocent human being. When we say the fetus is a human being, we're using the term human being in its biological meaning. What it means is member of the species Homo sapiens. Genetic humans, humans that are biologically or genetically, individuals who are genetically or biologically human. Is the human fetus biologically human? Yes. It's not a cat, it's not a dolphin, it's a human fetus, so yes, biologically. But in the first premise of the argument, it's wrong to kill innocent human beings, she says. What we're really talking about there is the moral sense of humanity, the sense of human being that we get in phrases like human rights. And what we're talking about there are full-fledged members of the moral community. So instead of talking about humans, and to avoid this confusion between the biological sense and the moral sense, she says, what we really should be talking about when we say it's wrong to kill humans is it's wrong to kill people or persons. And personhood, she wants to go on to say, is not intrinsically a biological term. Persons are beings with certain psychological characteristics, such as consciousness, the ability to be aware of one's surroundings. Self-consciousness, the awareness of oneself as a being that exists through time with a past and a future. Beings who can communicate by means of language. Beings who can reason. Beings who have the capacity for moral agency. It is these things that make us persons. Now, it's easy to confuse the two because all of you, and in fact, all of the persons I know and you know, are also genetic humans. You probably don't know any persons who are not humans. And so it's easy to think, well, it must be the case that the meaning is the same and all genetic humans, all and only genetic humans, have full moral status. But this is precisely what Warren denies. Why does she deny it? Well, she thinks, along with a number of philosophers on today's scene, that species is not a good basis for ascertaining or ascribing moral status. Because think about it for a moment. Even if all the persons you know are human, couldn't there be persons who are not human? And here we can go to literature, fiction, movies to think about this a little bit. In the movie E.T., the eponymous hero of E.T., E.T., was clearly not human, right? He was an alien. But would you say that he was a person, or that he should have a right to life, or that it wouldn't be okay to put him in a zoo or eat him for lunch? I mean, he was smart, he had moral agency, he had compassion, much smarter than the people around him. Seems like he would qualify not only as a person, but as someone with full moral status. Or the TV show Star Trek had Mr. Spock, who was half and half. He's also someone who was clearly someone entitled to moral consideration and moral concern. And the fact that he wasn't genetically human seems irrelevant. Well, sometimes people say, okay, that's fiction. But why is fiction relevant? What about the real world? Well, people have been questioning recently whether we shouldn't be treating very intelligent animals, perhaps our nearest cousins, chimps and gorillas, as persons, that maybe they shouldn't be caged, for example, or used in experimentation, which they've now stopped in the United States. What about dolphins? What about elephants? All of these animals seem to have much higher intelligence than many other animals. Why should the line be just with our species? And also, if you think about it, there are those who are not members of the species Homo sapiens who may also, are precursors, should be considered persons, like Neanderthals, who apparently had some forms of religion and art. Okay. So the argument now is this. Once we think about it for a while, it seems that to exclude some individuals from the moral community solely on the basis of their species membership, the number of chromosomes in their cells, just seems arbitrary and unjustified. And this has given rise to a new word that came into the vocabulary about 35 years ago, speciesism, right? Just as racism is bringing race into the discussion where it's not morally relevant, so speciesism is basing the treatment of a being on something that is not relevant. Is species sometimes relevant? Of course it is, right? There are ways you treat, I mean, you wouldn't put a horse in the water and you wouldn't take the fish out of the water. Species can make a big difference. But in terms of being entitled to basic moral consideration, it doesn't seem that species in itself is morally relevant. So this implies, at least, that being genetically human, a member of the species Homo sapiens, is not necessary for having full moral standing, right? If we met someone like E.T., it would be wrong to say, oh, wait a minute, he's not human, so we can cage him. No, that seems wrong. But the next stage would be to say, well, but is it a sufficient ground, is species membership a sufficient ground for moral status? Maybe all the conservative has to say is, okay, we're going to let some more in if we need any, but at least if you are human, you matter, you count, you get full protection. And Warren answers this by saying, well, no, because there can be human beings who lack moral status. What about those who have no capacity for consciousness, like those in permanent vegetative states, or anencephalics born without the capacity for consciousness because they lack a forebrain? And she thinks that these are not persons and do not have moral standing. So what are her conclusions about abortion? Well, if we're looking at the early gestation fetus, we are looking at a being which cannot think or experience anything. Brain waves start about 8 weeks, but brain waves are really not, they're necessary for experience, they're certainly not sufficient. And there just isn't enough development of the nervous system for there to be consciousness and the ability to experience pleasure and pain, or sentience as it's called. So at the very beginning, fetuses have no person-making characteristics at all, much less language and moral agency and all of that. They don't even have the capacity for consciousness, and therefore early abortion is clearly justifiable, not even an issue for Warren. Of course, some people will say, well, wait a minute, even if the fetus is not now have all these capacities, it has the potential for them. Just leave it alone, don't kill it, and it will get the ability to do all of those things and have all of those person-making characteristics. To this, people have responded, well, that also makes a logical mistake because potentiality gives you the potential to have rights. It doesn't give you actual rights. So think about it this way. Before Barack Obama took the oath of office, he was a potential president of the United States, but he wasn't, he had been elected, but he wasn't the president of the United States, right? So similarly, before the fetus becomes an actual person, it has the potential to have rights, including a right to life, but it doesn't have actual rights yet. Another response people make is, why draw the line with the fetus or the embryo? Why can't we also say that sperm and egg are potential persons? Put a sperm in a petri dish with eggs, and it will probably fertilize one of them, right? Peter Singer used to say, suppose I have 2 petri dishes, one in which fertilization has already occurred and one in which it hasn't yet occurred. Are you saying that if I dump out the one in which it's already occurred, as opposed to the one in which it hasn't yet occurred, I've done something horribly morally wrong, but not in the other case? It just seems kind of arbitrary. Warren herself just says that even in late gestation, where the fetus presumably now it can feel, it can even hear, right? It's becoming much more person-like than in early gestation, but nevertheless it's still less of a person than the pregnant woman, and therefore her interests in terminating the pregnancy outweigh the fetus's claim to not be killed. And therefore, she argues, abortion is justified throughout pregnancy. Well, her view, which is often called the person view, has come under serious criticism from a number of scholars, and a common theme is that it seems to prove too much. I mean, she justifies abortion by saying that even the late gestation fetus is less person-like than a mature mammal, but isn't that also true of a newborn, right? I mean, your dog is probably smarter than your newborn baby, right? And also, there may be human beings, who have almost none of the person-making characteristics that she talks about. What about the severely cognitively disabled? What about the elderly demented? It seems that Warren's person view is ruling out of moral status a lot of your blood relatives, you know, so it seems like it might be proving too much. So then we get another very well-known article in the literature by the philosopher Don Marquis. And Marquis says, look, both sides, liberals and conservatives, they've got it wrong. They both end up at a dead end, right? So what we need to do is get back to basics. We have to ask ourselves the fundamental question, what is it that makes killing wrong? Why do we think killing is wrong? And his analysis is known as the future like ours argument. The reason we think killing is wrong, he says, is that killing deprives the one who is killed of a future, and not just a future, but a future of value. If your future has no value in it, then you're not being deprived of very much. But if you're being deprived of a future of value, that's very serious. And what does he mean by a future of value? Well, in his original article, he doesn't say very much about it, but he just says generally, a future like ours, right? Where we have relationships and projects and things we want to do. That's what he means by that. And the advantage, he thinks, of his approach, which has been come to be known as the flow argument, or the flow theory, future like ours, is that it's not based on genetic humanity. He's not a speciesist. If there's an alien out there who has a future of value, then it's wrong to kill him. And if chimps and dolphins and elephants have futures of value, then maybe we're wrong to kill them too, right? Not speciesist. Nor is it based on being a person now. He's not claiming that the fetus is a person. He says, I never even use the word person. Not interested in persons. I'm interested in the valuable future that abortion deprives the fetus of. And it's not vulnerable to the arguments against potentiality theories, because he's not saying that the fetus is potentially has a future of value. No, he's saying the fetus now has a future of value in the same way that everybody in this room has a future. You don't potentially have a future. That's your future. And if you get killed now, sitting quietly listening to this lecture, you're going to be deprived of that future. Okay. So most of the times, fetuses do have futures of value. Sometimes they don't if they are very severely defective or a terrible disease. But in most cases, they do have futures of value, and in most cases, therefore, they're deprived of them by being killed, and therefore it's usually wrong to kill fetuses. Now, the flow argument is based on the assumption that the fetus has a valuable future, and that's further based on the assumption that the fetus is the same as the born human being in that they are one individual who have the same future because it's the same. It would be like saying, did you have the same future? Did you have a future when you were 5 and when you were 10 and when you were 15? Yes, it's just stages of development in one individual human life. And so whether I'm killed today, at my age now, or whether I was killed when I was 40, or whether I was killed when I was a teenager, or whether I was killed at birth, or whether I was aborted prior to being born, at every stage, doing that deprived me of my valuable future. And that's why it's wrong, MARQUIS says. But notice this rests on a very common assumption that most people don't even think about, namely, that what we are essentially is human organisms. That I come into existence as an organism which develops and gets different characteristics, and I remain alive until the organism dies. And not everybody agrees that we are essentially human organisms. And one philosopher who's very articulate on this topic is Jeff McMahon. So McMahon says, people think we're human organisms, but we're not. And if you think about it, you'll see why it is. And so one of his best examples is he has identical twin brothers, okay? And one of them has a body that's in great shape, but his brain is dying. The other one has a brain that is perfectly fine, but he's dying of a disease. His body is dying. Now, he says, what if we were able to perfect brain transplants? You know, philosophers like to say, what if, right? A little thought experiment. And so he says, if you were the twin who were dying because your body was going to die, but your brain was in great shape, and you could have your brain with all of its thoughts and memories transplanted into the skull of your twin, right, whose brain is dying. We remove his dying brain or his dead brain or whatever, and now you have this healthy body. And because he's your twin, it isn't even like weird. It's not like a girl and you were a man or something like that. It's, you know, it's your twin brother. Wouldn't you think when you woke up that that was you there? Whereas if you flip it and you take the other one, right, and you put your brain, now it's your brain and his body, would he think it was him? No, we wouldn't be thinking at all. He doesn't have a brain. So the intuition here is, with the brain transplant, that you go where your mind goes. And since our minds are embodied in our brains, you go where your brain goes, where your healthy, living brain goes. So he says, if that's the case, then we're not organisms at all. What we are, McMahon says, essentially is embodied minds, roughly, brains that are associated with bodies. So now how should we think about the fetus, the early gestation fetus, before it has an active brain that is capable of consciousness, a mind? What's my relationship with that early fetus? And what McMahon says is that's my empty organism. But I don't exist yet. I don't exist. I come into existence when my mind does, when my empty organism is sufficiently developed, its nervous system, to be conscious. And that means that abortion is not killing one of us. If I were aborted, I would not have been aborted. It would be more accurate, he says, to say my organism was aborted. Of course, I couldn't say it because. So for McMahon, abortion is really much more like contraception, right, than it is like killing a human being, killing one of us, right, because what we are essentially is embodied minds. It prevents one of us from coming into existence. And if we don't think that contraception is morally problematic, neither should we think of early abortion of the pre-sentient fetus, as morally problematic. And so now I'm going to present my own view, which I call the interest view, and it is going to be a race through this view. But if you're interested in the full view, it's in the book that Han mentioned, Life Before Birth, The Moral and Legal Status of Embryos and Fetuses. I am pro-choice, just to make that clear from the beginning, and I hold that what endows a being with moral standing and the same moral status as all of us, and rights, including the right to life, is the possession of interests. And the reason I think there's a connection between moral standing and interests is through an analogy with rights. What rights do is protect our interests. So if a being doesn't have any interests, it can't have rights, and it's meaningless to talk about moral standing. So mere things, for example, which don't have any interests of their own at all, we might have interest in them. We might have an interest in keeping my car running well and clean and things like that. But I don't do that for the car, right? Because the car is a thing and it doesn't care. By contrast, when we talk about conscious beings like us and like animals, for example, we can talk about what is in their interest, what they have a stake in. Now, my view, therefore, is less restrictive than Warren's person view because I'm not really interested, in the beginning at least, in all of these person-making characteristics. I'm interested in what do you need to be able to have interests, and that's pretty bare bones. It's the capacity to experience pain and pleasure, to have some kind of conscious awareness or sentience. And therefore, I'm not subject to the criticism that she is, that it excludes infants or the cognitively impaired or the people with dementia. Nor is my view based on identity. I think the identity question, when did I come into existence, is interesting, but it's not part of the interest view. I don't think that really is what matters. What matters is whether we have a being with interests, and generally if a being has an interest in suffering, the being counts. Now, interests are conceptually connected with sentience. I've been saying this a little bit already, and that's why we can say that automobiles don't have interest, but animals do. There are some intermediate kinds of cases that are interesting, like plants. After all, plants are not sentient, and yet we think we can do things for plants. We water them, we fertilize them. But yes, if you don't do those things that plants need, they'll die, they'll get sick. But the plants themselves don't have a stake in continuing to live or being healthy. So I don't think we do things for the sake of the plant, but rather we have an interest in their continuing to survive. And I think this is a real difference between plants and animals. If you're raising an animal, you might not care about its subjective well-being, but it certainly has a subjective well-being in a way that corn, for example, does not. And it seems to me that the non-sentient fetus is more like corn and less like, cows in this respect. The fact that it has a future like ours doesn't make it care about that future now. And so it seems to me that when we talk about abortion, we are not talking about something that is a harm to the early gestation fetus, any more than it's a harm to sperm and eggs that are prevented from coming into contact with another and being fertilized. So on my view, prior to the onset of sentience, fetuses have no moral standing. They are morally comparable to human gametes. By the way, that doesn't mean that people who get pregnant don't care tremendously about their fetuses. Of course they do, because they don't intend them to be fetuses. Ultimately, they intend them to be babies. And we do care about our future children. If sentience matters so much, when does it occur? And this actually turns out to be fairly controversial. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists says sometime between 24 and 28 weeks, roughly the same time as viability, that is, when the fetus can survive outside the woman's body. But not everybody agrees with that. Some people think it occurs later, some people think it occurs earlier. A physician researcher in the United Kingdom, Vivek Glover, has argued that it might be as early as 17 weeks. So what can we say that we actually know? I think what we have to say is we don't know, but there's a continuum. And no one is suggesting, no responsible researcher thinks that it can be prior to 17 weeks gestation, and certainly by the third trimester, you have a sentient being. So fetuses do not have moral standing on their own until they become sentient, whenever that is. On the other hand, at all stages, fetuses have value for their prospective parents who want them to be alive and healthy and come into existence. And that's why we can explain why the killing of a fetus through an attack on a pregnant woman is wrong. It just compounds the attack on her, and that's a very serious wrong. It's completely consistent with legal abortion. The interest view is also a gradualist view, because what it says is before sentience, the fetus has no stake in its own existence, and therefore you don't have to think about, well, what about the fetus interests? It doesn't have any in early abortion. And in the United States, at least, the vast number of abortions take place very early in gestation, about over 60% in the first 8 weeks and about 90% in the first trimester. But as the fetus develops, it becomes more and more like the newborn in morally relevant ways. It has sentience, it can feel, it can experience, right? And it acquires interests of its own, primarily the interest in not experiencing pain. And by the way, this would be an argument for anesthesia in the case of late abortion, because the interest of the fetus is primarily in not feeling pain rather than in continued existence. But also, as the fetus develops and looks more like a human baby, all of our protective instincts for babies kick in for fetuses. And therefore, we think that late abortion is worse than earlier abortion, and the reasons for it have to be stronger. That's what's characteristic of a gradualist position. And I think it's kind of ironic that neither the conservative nor the liberal can take what I take to be this very plausible position. After all, the conservative says that from the extreme conservative from fertilization, the moderate conservative from implantation, it's a human person, it has all the rights, way back there. So why should killing it earlier be any better than killing it later? Shouldn't be on the conservative view. And similarly, the liberal, like Marianne Warren, says that abortion is permissible throughout gestation, So late abortion is no worse than early abortion. I don't think anybody actually believes that. Not conservatives and not liberals. So I think people really are gradualists, even if they don't cop to it. What about late abortions? The landmark case of Roe v. Wade, which I said I would mention, said that all women everywhere in the United States have a fundamental constitutional right to choose abortion prior to viability, that is between 24 and 28 weeks of gestation. And after viability, states may, if they choose, they don't have to, but they may, prohibit abortion. Except, and this is a very important exception, where the abortion would be necessary to preserve the woman's life or health. And health is broadly interpreted to include psychological considerations as well as physical health. In fact, late abortions are not available to many women in the United States. They don't have access to abortion because there are no abortion providers at all in rural areas. And most abortion providers do not perform late abortions, and the one who was doing it was murdered, right? George Till. Abortion is not covered by federal Medicaid dollars, so poor women cannot get abortions. And what this all means, the lack of access to abortion, means that if a woman wants an abortion, she has to get the money somehow, which may take time. She has to find someone who will do it. If she has children, she has to find someone to take care of them. If she has a job, she needs to get time off. And all of this means later abortions. So if you want late abortions, do all of the things we're already doing in the United States. If you want early abortions, you have to improve access. What about the interest view? I've said that my view is that sentience matters as a ground for counting, and that the sentient fetus therefore counts. I've already mentioned anesthesia should be administered for late abortions where this will not risk the woman's health. I think a sentient fetus has some interest. It has an interest in avoiding pain, but because it also is beginning to have a life that it can value, I think it has a weak, not a strong, but a weak interest in continued existence. And that's why the moral reasons for abortion in late gestation should be robust. And in fact, they almost always are. Women do not have late abortions because they're sitting around thinking, do I really want to do this? I don't know. I think I'll wait another 6 months before I figure it out. No, that's not what happens. Most late abortions are had for the social reasons that I mentioned already, but also a woman who has a wanted pregnancy develops a terrible health condition in past mid-gestation, and now she has to have an abortion, or sometimes because of fetal indications, which are discovered through prenatal testing. So in my first edition of Life Before Birth, I thought it was reasonable to put restrictions on abortion by time, if a woman had enough time to make the decision. But I've changed my mind about that. I think legal restrictions on abortions in terms of stage of abortion are unwarranted. This has to be a decision that a woman makes in conjunction with her doctor. As George Tiller, the murdered abortion provider, had buttons made up for his staff that said, "Trust women." So far, I've been talking completely about the moral status of the fetus and different views about that, but that's only half of the justification for abortion. Equally important is the fact that fetuses do not exist floating in the atmosphere. They have to be grown and sustained in a particular woman's body. And the woman, therefore, is in essence serving as a life support system for the fetus, right? So women's rights to bodily self-determination are just as important, it seems to me, in the justification of abortion, something which many people who talk about abortion simply never discuss. Women are not, to use George Annis's phrase, fetal containers. So in my view, no woman should be forced to continue a pregnancy if she is not ready to be a mother, or if she has already completed her childbearing years. I think that a contraception is preferable to abortion, although abortion is morally perhaps more like contraception than it's like murder. Nevertheless, contraception is not a big deal for women in the way that abortion is. But abortion is and always will be necessary as a backup when contraception fails, either because people don't use it correctly or because sometimes even things used correctly fail. And another important factor is women's equality. It is well known that if women cannot control their own fertility, whether and when they bear children, they will never attain equality. So I think that laws that prohibit or restrict abortion are unjustifiable, but equally so are laws forcing or coercing abortion. Women have to make their own decisions about when and where they will bear children. And that's it. And I'd be happy to answer any questions, people, or comments, entertain comments.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, for this fascinating lecture. I have two questions. The first one has to do with potential of the fetus being a potential human being or potential person. And I mean, Peter Singer has argued that a prince might be a potential king, but he is not a king.
Right.
So a prince doesn't have the right of a king. On the other hand, a prince, for example, Prince Charles, even though he's not a king, he's not a commoner either.
Right.
So in the case of Barack Obama, I mean, after he has won the election, but before he's sworn in, suppose there's a law saying that in order to be the president of the United States, you have to sworn in. Between that short period of time, Obama isn't just anyone. So that's the first question. I mean, I'm just thinking that maybe various theory, pro-choice theory, maybe they should take into account the fact that a fetus is a potential person as well. I'm not saying that a potential person has the same legal status as a person.
Right.
So the second question I want to ask is, I read part of your book, and which is very, very interesting. Am I correct to think that one of your claims is that we have to take into account the interests of the future people now? I mean, we have to take into interests of the future people, right?
Yep.
If that's correct, I won't be able to articulate my sense of tension, but
it's okay, I'll do it for you.
Okay, but I sense some tension between that claim and also the claim that we don't need to take into account the interests of a fetus. Okay, thank you.
So those are two excellent questions. I mean, this was a race through a lot of material. I think the first question had to do with the moral relevance of potentiality. Even if a fetus is not now a person and doesn't have the rights of an actual person, doesn't it have some value in virtue of being potentially a person? And I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. Look, bulbs are not tulips. But if you say, well, I'm throwing out all these bulbs, I'm only interested in tulips, I don't want any of these bulbs around, that would be very stupid, right? So if you're interested in, if you think that people have value, then potential people will have some sort of reflected value. Of course, the difference is you might say, yes, I think people have value, but we may not want to bring in people right now. But I think it's absolutely true that you can soften the argument from potentiality so that it's not making the logical mistake of ascribing actual rights to potential people and simply saying instead, potential people, because they could become people, can be seen as valuable. And as I said, any woman who is pregnant doesn't go around saying things like, well, I'm going to go buy a buggy for my fetus and then paint the fetus's room. No, she says, I'm going to buy the baby a buggy and I'm going to paint the baby's room because we're thinking about the baby once it's born, which is what they're looking forward to. Which brings me to future people. And this is complicated, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. I do think that actual people existing in the future have strong claims on our concern and our behavior. I'd be happy to talk about it in terms of rights. We know that we have very good reason to believe that there will be people in the future, whether it's 50 years from now, 100 years from now. I'm not going to go too much farther than that because we might all be victims of global warming. But anyway, 100 years. We don't know who they are. They don't exist now. But certainly I think it would be wrong for us to do things that would make their lives much worse off if we could avoid doing that without huge sacrifices ourselves. So now Han says, well, if future people count, aren't fetuses future people? So don't they count too? No, I would say, because the people existing in the future have lots of interests, an interest in drinking water that is not polluted, in breathing air that is not polluted. They actually will suffer from what we do now, even though they don't exist now. I mean, if you think about it, that can happen. Somebody, this is an example from, I think it's Derek Parfit. If somebody, it might be Joel Feinberg, a bomber plants a bomb in a kindergarten room and times it to go off in 5 years, when it goes off and blows up all the kindergarten, I'm terribly sorry about this example, but anyway, all of those children will suffer. None of them exist now. So we can do things now that will cause people in the future to suffer. Fetuses are not like that, at least not presentient ones. So I don't think we have to concern ourselves with fetuses unless they will come into existence. So therefore, if you're pregnant, don't binge drink, don't smoke cigarettes, don't take crack cocaine. It's not good for your developing fetus, but what you're really talking about is the child you're going to have who may be severely cognitively impaired because of things that you did now. So what I'm saying is to have an abortion does not harm anyone. Let's restrict ourselves to early abortion, the simpler case, does not harm anyone, but binge drinking during early pregnancy may very well harm someone.
Just to be controversial, as a male, you talk about the rights of the embryo, you talk the rights about the mother.
Is that not working? Okay.
But does the father have any rights? Let's say the mother wants to abort the baby, but the father doesn't want to abort the baby. How do you reconcile their position?
Well, the short answer is no, because it is the woman who has to endure the inconveniences, burdens, and risks of pregnancy, and even normal pregnancy has many of them, and an abnormal pregnancy can actually be life-threatening. And I don't think any one human being has the right to ask another human being to do that. But of course, we're talking about there could be a case where they love one another, they're planning to have a child, and now they have a disagreement about the timing of it. In those kinds of cases, we hope that people who love one another can work it out. But ultimately, it seems that the one who is going to go through gestation, labor, and delivery is the one who has to make the decisions about that.
We always said life is sacred, but if abortion is legal for any reason, would it create other problems that harm our interests? For example, devaluing human?
Well, that's a very interesting point, actually. I mean, it's bringing in a theological term about the sacredness of life, which I would prefer not to do. But the other part of yours was, what might be the impact? Well, we've had legal abortion in the United States since 1972, and I don't think that there has been a devaluation of human life. People talked about the possibility of an increase of child abuse. That hasn't happened. Abortion has been legal in England longer than that through the legislative process, not by any court. So I just think that if it were true, it would be an interesting question. And the reason I say that is people are now talking about the legalization of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and particularly has the legalization of physician-assisted suicide resulted in an increase of suicides. If that were the case, what should we say? And that brings up the question about whether people's fundamental rights can be limited. But in fact, that doesn't seem to be the case with suicide, and it doesn't seem to be the case with abortion. So it could happen, but it hasn't.
I just want to follow from that question, actually. So what do you think about the other way around? Do you think that a potential father has a justifiable reason to ask for an abortion?
Well, he might have a justifiable reason to ask for an abortion, but only the woman gets to decide.
But what's the reason? Because this time it's not the health reasons, right? The reason for asking for the, you cannot ask for the pregnancy to continue because of the health reasons. Abortion is sort of the opposite.
Right.
So.
You're right. They're not exactly parallel because having an abortion is not 9 months of burden and risk and inconvenience. On the other hand, having an abortion, I think forced abortions are a terrible violation of the woman's rights of bodily autonomy. I think it's horrible when women are forced to have abortions. And I also think that it's wrong for men to, coerce or nudge or whatever a woman to have an abortion. And I actually think this is even in case, there have been some very interesting cases, starting with Frank Serpico, who was the New York City cop that they made the movie about, Serpico, and if you haven't seen it, that's your assignment for this weekend. But in any event, he had a girlfriend, and he told her, I do not want to have a child, so you better be using birth control. And she said, absolutely, I'm using birth control. And when she got pregnant, she sued him for child support, and he fought it. He said, no, why am I responsible for this? I told her I didn't want a child. She swore up and down she was using birth control. Why am I supposed to pay for the kid? And the judge said, let's see, you want the state to pay or you want to pay? We choose you. And that's basic. Then there was a worse one. You think that one's bad enough? My male students were all going, what? Yeah, she's the one who gets to make the decision. Maybe you might want to think about birth control yourselves. The next one was a guy whose girlfriend was performing an act of fellatio on him, and she excused herself, saved the sperm, and artificially inseminated herself, and when the baby was born, sued him for child support. Now, that's even worse, because at least you could say to Serpico, well, why didn't you use a condom, you idiot? But, how would this guy have reasonably expected that, that might result in a child being born? But still, the court said, yeah, no, sorry, we're just going to do it on the basis of genetic fatherhood. And there really is, I suppose, an argument for saying, morally, he's not responsible, and yet now we're saying as a society that he has to support that child until age 18. So.
I have a question that follows the reply to Han, actually. You suggest that a pregnant woman can harm the future baby if she takes cigarette or cocaine during her pregnancy. How could that harm the future person, the future baby? Because if, for example, he take drugs and then the future baby becomes severely retarded, it seems to me that if she didn't take that drugs, that fetus, the baby wouldn't be retarded, and it seems totally another person, so.
I'm not sure I'm following your question, but this is a good example of genuine harming. If let's take alcohol, because with alcohol, binge drinking at least, you can cause fetal alcohol syndrome, which is clearly associated with cognitive deficits, okay? And not reversible, whereas a lot of the drugs, you can change it, but it's irreversible. Had she abstained from alcohol during her pregnancy, that baby would have been born healthy and whole. She harmed the baby by binge drinking, right? It's not a non-identity problem where you substitute a different baby here. So what I'm saying is, by binge drinking during pregnancy, she makes that child cognitively impaired when otherwise it would have been mentally normal, right? And therefore, because she brought it into existence, there's now a person walking around who is disadvantaged, right? But when we're talking about, and so that's clearly if she aborts it instead, then no person is walking around cognitively impaired. Or were you saying that it's better to be born than not to be cognitively impaired? No, you weren't saying that, okay. Did I get your? Yeah. Okay.
I believe he was saying it's a different person.
But it isn't.
The damaged child is.
But it isn't. It's the same.
The damaged child doesn't recognize the other child. The damaged child has a different life, such a different life.
Yeah, but then that would be like saying, once the baby is born, I think I'm going to deafen the baby, and it'll be totally different. It won't speak. It'll have deaf language. It's a different person. And they go, yeah, you just got arrested. No, it's the same. Maybe if I may adopted the organism identity thing, it is the same child. Yeah, we all are going to be very different depending on what happens to us. If your parents had beat you every day of your life and starved you and locked you in a closet, you'd be a very different person. But you're still the same individual, and if they hadn't done that, you'd be the lovely person you are today.
So identity does matter.
I think identity matters a lot when we're talking about responsibility, Yeah.
Sorry, I want to follow that. Then you have to rely on the organism-based identity, right?
Yeah.
Then abortion seems wrong in that occasion because that fetus, if you abort, then you just disturbed it.
Well, if you're Jeff McMahon, you think identity matters, and if you're somebody who takes the organism view, like David deGrazia, you think it did. But my view doesn't depend on that. My view depends on whether it has interests. I mean, what do I think about identity? I'll tell you what I think about identity. I think in one way, I'm a human organism, and that I can trace my existence back not only to pregnancy, my mother being pregnant, but probably to conception, even though no one can identify it, but I mean, that's when I started as an organism. But I also think, in another sense, I'm not just an organism, I'm also a mind, and therefore if I go into a persistent vegetative state, I think one way to look at it is, yeah, that's me over there in that bed, but in another way, I've left you a long time ago. So I think we're both organisms and embodied mind. I don't think a lot hinges on what view of identity you take.
Bonnie, very educative experience for me. I want to ask a question, somewhat related but unrelated. What is your view on this program that this activist has in the United States, paying $500 to women who are crack cocaine addicts for sterilization or abortion?
I think it's horrible. I think you should use the money to help people get off get rid of their addictions. I don't think anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I love being an addict. This is my thing, it's just so great. People are addicted because of horrible circumstances usually in their lives, and then they get pregnant, right? And it's very bad for the baby and it's very bad for them. But it's a teachable moment, actually, pregnancy. And I think, so that's what you want to do. You want to get women who are addicted off of the drugs in a very careful way, because you can't just go cold turkey. That could be harmful to the developing fetus as well. I don't think anybody should tell anybody else whether they can have children or how many children they can have.
I'm just wondering what you think about, I'm inspired by the question up there. I mean, if someone can be harmed at a later stage as a result of his mother's drinking binge during the first month of pregnancy, I mean, can someone also be harmed by abortion? I mean, that person would have existed had there been no abortion.
Right.
Now the abortion caused him not to exist.
Right. But the same is true, isn't it, Han? If you neglect to have sex with your wife at a particular time when she's fertile, right? I mean, all of us could be bringing, well, not all of us, not me, but many of you could be bringing so many wonderful children into the world if you would just have more sex. So the fact that someone would have been born, seems to me, is not decisive unless you want to say. By the way, there was one philosopher who did think that contraception was morally problematic, and that's R.M. Hare. Yeah, he did. He had a golden rule thing. He said, but you know, it gets outweighed. I don't think it is morally problematic. So again, that child who has to go through life with physical and mental problems that he wouldn't have had if she had not been drinking has clearly been harmed, it seems to me. But not bringing anybody into the world is like not having gotten pregnant in the beginning in terms of the effect on the individual. There's, you know, how many unborn children? Uncounted.
So this just follows up on Han's thought there. So what would you say to the following line of thought? You have a pregnant mother who binge drinks, and it's discovered that this has caused harm to the fetus. And then someone says to her, don't worry, there's a way to undo this harm, just get an abortion.
Right. Right. No, it's a very serious question, actually, because in the United States, pregnant women who were particularly illegal drug users, not so much alcohol, but illegal drug users, when the child was born, if there was neurological problems, they were put in jail. So you could just, not just there's a way to solve this problem, there's a way to avoid jail, have an abortion, right? So I think it's very important to tell pregnant women and women who are about to become pregnant two things. One, lay off the booze, lay off the cigarettes, lay off the drugs. But if you're already addicted, don't think it's absolutely going to happen that your baby's going to be damaged. We're going to try to help you to get off it as much as we can, but you shouldn't think that you're morally obligated to have an abortion, because it's a risk, is what it is. It's a risk. And if you knew for certain that the child was doomed to a horrible life, maybe abortion might be morally obligatory. But I don't think you can know that. But what you can say is it's better not to do it, because all of us should want to have children who are as healthy as they can be, or at least take reasonable steps. It doesn't mean that you have to quit your job and move to another neighborhood which might have better air quality or something. But at least you can do things which prevent the really risky things from happening that, by the way, aren't good for the woman either, right? Cigarette smoking, binge drinking, crack cocaine, not good for her either, so.
So the sterilization of women who are already on crack cocaine extends Michael's argument even further. And in fact, many of them do not want children. Children happen accidentally.
Well, if anybody wants to be sterilized, I think that she has the right to that. But you were talking about dangling large sums of money, right, in front of them. I would feel differently, I think, about saying sterilization will be covered for every woman who wants it. It's going to be free. And then if people who don't want children, whether or not they're crack addicts, they could get it. But I think there's something distasteful about saying you are not worthy of being able to do this. I know it's really tough when you see women coming into the hospital to give birth again and again and again, and their children are damaged. But I think we ought to resist those sorts of judgmental attitudes, instead have a more holistic attitude of healthy mother, healthy baby, and try to prevent if we can.
Bonnie, you are now trading off the rights of the child versus the rights of the mother. Because the child say, I didn't want to be born of a crack cocaine mother.
But of course, what are its choices? Is it being born of a crack cocaine mother or not being born at all? I would venture to say that most children, even who are born to crack cocaine addicts, don't wish that they had never been born. They wish their mothers hadn't been crack cocaine addicts. So I'm not sure that you can talk about, look, I don't think anybody should be forced to have children. And I think that the ability to control fertility belongs to women. I just don't like the idea that we should coerce people or even pressure people into things they don't really want. That seems to me wrong. And especially because in the United States it has so many class and race overtones. We are not generally talking about white women here. We're talking about black women, and I just don't like it.
We can discuss this outside later. Because I'm not happy with your answer.
Sterilization.
I just wonder if you'd like to speak a little bit about how the non-legal but cultural coercion of women into abortion has damaged a couple of generations of men in China and, say, in India, because disproportionate numbers of girl fetuses were aborted. So now we see these men who are not going to have lives that they ought to have economically or socially because wives will not be available to them.
Well, this is sort of my view about social planning in general. There are all these pesky, unexpected, or unforeseen consequences, which if you thought about it for about 2 minutes, you could have predicted, right? And now we've got the children saying we're part of the great social experiment of only one child, and we're not happy about that either. And now they're reversing it. You know, it'll probably correct itself in time, but maybe it would be better just to let people make their own choices. Well, it's time for tea and coffee, isn't it?